In March 1987, a private investigator was found dead with an axe embedded in his head. It would become the most investigated unsolved murder in the history of the Metropolitan Police. Multiple inquiries into the killing would reveal evidence of police cover-ups and corruption. It was a case that authorities wouldn't, rather than couldn't, solve. More than 3 decades later on, no one has been convicted for the crime. This is what happens when law enforcement's reputation ranks higher than justice. This is the unsolved murder of Daniel Morgan. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Ooh, today's case. It's an old one, but it's a good one. I decided to cover this, and believe me, this is not an easy case to cover. Sometimes I'll take on a case and the research is just a little bit on the stacked side. And this was on the stacked, new room stacked side. But nonetheless, I have a personal interest in this particular crime itself because I know people who've been involved in investigating it and looking at the re-investigations, so to speak, and also because I know what they think happened. Nonetheless, it was one of those cases that, again, I've taken a while to get to covering because genuinely I want to do it justice, and it's quite a complicated one, so strap in. And you guys also know that I have a big thing about corruption in authority. I know that where there is power, there is often corruption. Not always. There are good people in this world who are powerful. They are, shall we say, the best people for the jobs. But there are many people who find themselves in positions and they are fully able to be corrupted. And without a doubt, we're going to cover that in detail today. And it's really scary because when corruption lives in places and spaces that we rely on for justice, it means that at times there is no justice at all. Let me take you back to 1987. We've got a 37-year-old Welshman, Daniel Morgan, living in London. He's living with his wife, Iris, and they also have 2 young children. That's 6-year-old Sarah and 4-year-old Dan. Now, despite having an agricultural-based education in the past, Daniel had a really excellent memory for small details. He was somebody that could really remember small details like car registrations, etc., which is really, really helpful because you need to have an excellent memory if you decide that you want to go into a job like a private investigator. And that's exactly what happened in February 1981. He launches this small private investigation agency. It's called Southern Investigations, and it's launched in Thornton Heath, South London. His partner that he launches it with in that venture was Jonathan Rees. Now, Daniel in the company, he mainly dealt with the process serving and bailiff side of the business, but it's believed in 1987, early in 1987, he ends up starting to investigate possible police corruption within the Met Police. Now, we all know these big organisations don't like it when some small fry starts potentially investigating them for misdemeanours. Just gonna put that out there right now. We get to the 10th of March 1987. So Daniel leaves his home around 8:30 a.m. that morning. Just goes about his regular business. So he has business meetings, etc. Before he leaves the office at 6 p.m, he says to Rees, his business partner, that he'd see him later that night around 7:30 p.m. in the Golden Lion pub. Do you remember back in the day? A lot of people did business in pubs. Then they brought in the no smoking rule and pubs died. Don't know why, but that actually happened. Literally, they stopped people being allowed to smoke in pubs and everyone was like, I'm just going to drink in my own home from now on. But back in the day, certainly in this time frame, people did used to go to the pub in the evenings and do business. So earlier that very evening, Daniel had actually spent some time with a woman that he was allegedly having an affair with. She was called Margaret Harrison. So she worked at an estate agent's nearby his office. Allegedly, the pair went to a wine bar around 6:20 p.m. They then left around 7:15 p.m. and Daniel told her that he was off to meet Rees. He then called his wife, Iris, said that they'd got a meeting, that he'd be back around 8:15 p.m. He's quite specific about those details. His wife expected him to be there, and that was normal within his behaviour. He would inform her of where he was and what time he'd be leaving and when he'd be returning home. And not long after that phone call, an acquaintance actually spotted him on Thornton Heath High Street. Also, he said that when he spotted him, he looked like he was in possession of several beige files. Also, the way that he was walking, there was a sense of anxiety around him. He seemed to be in quite a hurry. Now, around 7:30 p.m, he does go to the Golden Lion Public House in Sydenham, that's in southeast London, just as he'd arranged. He meets his business partner here, Rees, and according to Rees, they're meeting an associate professional bodyguard called Paul Goodridge. Now, just for a side note, Goodridge was also the uncle of Kim Vine, and that's the wife of Glenn Vine, who's Rees's brother-in-law. You're going to have to get used to a lot of these names coming in. Just kind of keep them in your memory. It's all going to make sense. So the alleged meeting, it's meant to be for a purpose of introducing them to someone who could loan them money. Because at the time, Southern Investigations were being sued by Belmont Car Auctions. Apparently there'd been a breach of contract, so there'd been a claim that had been lodged with the High Court, and they needed to find £10,000, which today doesn't seem that massive. I suppose we're used to hearing about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds where people are sued in court, but actually £10,000 back then was a lot of money, and it's certainly not easy to come by. So the day before this meeting, Goodridge had told Rees that he actually might know someone who could help. But according to Rees, Goodridge hadn't shown up. So he and Daniel at that point had had a few drinks, they'd talked, clearly there was a lot to talk about. Rees claimed that he apparently left the pub around 9 p.m, and that was shortly before Daniel. So Daniel was close behind him, and apparently he was finishing writing a few notes up onto some paper. Yes, we're talking about a time where you didn't just wander around with your iPhone in the notes capacity or your laptop in a slim case. Back in the day, you know, computers were so big they needed their own room, that kind of thing. So paper, it was all the rage. So this is all quite contextual. This is not unusual behaviour. Now, Rees allegedly left through the front door of the pub, and he presumed that Daniel had actually left through the rear door. Now, after leaving Daniel, Rees had then actually gone and met Goodridge in Beulah Spa pub that was 3 miles away in Crystal Palace. Now, at 9:40 a.m, a customer drives into the Golden Lion pub rear car park. Car headlights just picks up something odd, something in the dark, in the corner, lying between 2 parked cars. And at first, what went through their mind is, this is a mannequin's dummy, it's just on the floor, it's a tailor's dummy. But he's inquisitive enough and he approaches, and as he does, he starts to realise that this isn't a tailor's dummy at all. It's a dead body. And it was. It was Daniel. He's lying between his green BMW and a blue Morris Marina. He's face up. He's in a suit and black shoes. The right pocket of his trousers and the outside seam is torn, almost actually down to the knee. But what's most startling about this situation is Daniel has an axe embedded still in his head. Horrifying discovery for that individual. Now, it's suspected that the killing had been made to look like a botched robbery, hence the rip in his clothes and so on and so forth. Daniel's Rolex watch had actually been stolen, but the robbery theory gets dismissed really, really quickly. First of all, he's got a bundle of cash in his pocket. He's got more than £1,000 in his pocket. So if you're going to go to the effort of killing somebody with an axe because you want to steal from them, then you're going to definitely take the spoils of that theft, and £1,000 is certainly something you're going to be happy to run off with. For a start, you can trace a Rolex, but that cash you'd be able to walk away and spend however you like. No one's going to be able to know it's you unless there was a witness, which there wasn't. Also, they saw 2 packets of ready salted crisps. So that says to me he was taking those packets of crisps home for he and his wife, which is really sad. But also, another reason why they discounted the robbery theory was because the keys to his BMW were literally found next to his body. They could have taken the car, but they didn't. But the thing that wasn't present, the very thing that we would expect to be present, are the beige files that he'd earlier been seen clutching. And those files were never recovered, nor were the notes that he'd been writing shortly before his death. Now, instantly that's suspicious, isn't it? Why on earth would somebody who wanted to rob him take files? Surely the motive would be possessions, money. And so instantly we're starting to think about this crime in a very, very different way. The reasoning behind it certainly doesn't sound like it's a random killing, does it? Now, that customer who discovered Daniel, apparently he very calmly went into the pub and told the landlord that he had a problem in the car park. Isn't it interesting the way that people react to these things, you know? I'm not saying I would be hysterically running around the car park screaming, there's a man with an axe in his head, but I think that's more likely than me just like nonchalantly and calmly walking into the pub and being like, excuse me, I'll have some salt and vinegar crisps and I'll get a tonic water as well if that's okay. By the way, bit of an issue in your car park. Yeah, you've got a guy with an axe in his head. Yeah, you wanna sort that out. It's not going to be great for the business, is it? But no, apparently it was quite calm. So at this point, and there's something about this era, everybody has a particular fixation on decades. But with respect, the resilience of people back in the day, I just think was higher, because I can see this scene literally playing out. Just telling the landlord there's somebody with an axe in the head, and then the landlord and he go outside to Daniel's body, and at this point the customer touches Daniel's hand to check whether he was alive, and it was cold. So at this point at 9:50 p.m, the landlord telephones the local police station in Catford. Again, that's kind of interesting because it was 999 that you could have called, but they go for the local police station, so they know the number, of course, is the landlord of a local pub. That means he's probably used to having to call the local police station, asking them to come and remove people from his residence, shall we say. So now the police have been informed, and essentially they're going to come and see exactly what's happened. When they do the autopsy on Daniel, it is pretty horrific. The injuries were catastrophic. Obviously he died, but it's the way he died. So he'd been struck around 4 times in the head with an axe. I mean, the power of doing that, and certainly the whole premise was to murder him, wasn't it? It wasn't to reduce him to a position where he can't fight back so he can have things stolen. This is an execution. When they looked at the impact on his brain, yeah, it had caused incredible, intense brain damage. That's why he died. There were absolutely no evidence at all of defense wounds, so that means it was likely he was struck from behind. He was probably stood next to his car, getting himself together, particularly if you had those files with him. You've got to maneuver yourself, haven't you, into the car, open it, and you're kind of very fixated on the actions that you're carrying out in that moment. Somebody comes up behind you, smashes you in the head with an axe. You don't stand a chance. You're probably not even aware of what's playing out. And as soon as that one strike knocks you unconscious, the other strikes had apparently been delivered in rapid succession, and the last one was done as he lay on his back on the car park tarmac. And the actual axe itself, well, that's interesting as well, because that had elastoplast strips around the shaft. For those of you who don't know what elastoplast is, it's a plaster for putting over grazes and scrapes and cuts, for minor injuries, shall we say. But it was used here so that they weren't going to leave any fingerprints. Again, premeditated and planned, certainly doesn't want to get caught, takes away the idea of it potentially being some drug-addled individual who's desperate to get some money. To me, we're starting to talk about something that feels very orchestrated and organised. So at this point, the murder investigation's launched by the Met Police. It's called the Morgan 1 investigation. Now, this investigation was headed by Detective Superintendent Douglas Campbell. And I don't even know how to describe this without just swearing a lot. I won't swear a lot because slightly unprofessional, but totally appropriate. Because, wow, you want to mess up a case? We're going to mess this up real well. So from the start, massive failings in the handling of the case, and the case itself, investigation-wise, was in the future described as poor at best. So poor at best. So if I'm looking at this in an inquiry and I'm saying, what could have happened and been done better? Were there failings? And then at the end it's like, well, I've come to the conclusion that at the very, very best, if I give you the investigation on its very best day, it's really not great. And that means if it's poor at best, what are we going to say? Massively corrupt at worst? Premeditated corruption at worst? Who knows? Just throwing words out there. I'll let you guys decide how accurate my assumption is. So in many respects, one of the big problems is that they didn't actually have any compliance with police policies and procedures. So when you have a crime scene, every single one of us, we don't even need to be qualified in forensics. We don't need to be a serving police officer of any level. We know that if somebody is found dead in mysterious circumstances, and actually circumstances per se, for your first instance of finding a dead body, what do? You secure the crime scene. ABC. It's just logical. And as I say, you don't need any experience in law enforcement to do this. But they don't do that. They didn't properly seal the clear murder scene. So whilst they did kind of tape off just the immediate area where the body was found, the crime scene should have encompassed a far bigger area. It should have encompassed the entire pub, the grounds of the pub, the surrounding alleys, because people often discard things in alleys. They weren't even searched. They were not even searched. Literally left unguarded. Just walk through. Has there been a murder in the car park? There has been a murder in the car park. Isn't it important to secure the crime scene so that I can't have this picnic in this car park? Have the picnic. Have it. I don't know whether that's appropriate, but okay, I'll have the car park. You may as well have a watch. We're all watching. All these people walking through the crime scene, really interested in it. Yeah, it's not going to be a problem. Just going to enjoy my cucumber sandwich. Seriously, what is happening here? One of the witnesses was even able to drive his car through the car park and out again. Just drive in, drive out, compromise everything forensically, just have a good look, just rub a neck. What's going on there then? It's a man with an axe in his head. It's a little bit more interesting than I thought when I drove in this car park and there was the people around here. I'll just reverse out now. Seriously, total nightmare. Even worse, they didn't have any evidence that the immediate vicinity where the body was found was searched. Imagine investigating a case and not even checking where the body was found and around the body. Just seemingly, shall we say, not caring. One could say professionally choosing not to care. The forensic officers who came, all they did, they searched Daniel's pockets and they looked in his car that he hadn't been in because he had an axe in his head lay on the floor by the car. So that made no sense. And also they made a visual sweep of the rear car park. What are you? I'm a forensic expert. Oh, that sounds very interesting. What do you do? I forensically detail crime scenes. I make sure that, no stone is unturned. Right, that seems like a really diligent job. It is. It's basically the be-all and end-all when it comes down to these cases reaching court, and particularly finding the individuals guilty for these crimes. Do you do a really, really deep dive search of areas and environments? I do. Do you want to see me do it right now? Oh, God, I would love to. Do you know what? I've just driven into this car park and I'm going to go in a minute, but at the end of the day, I'd love to see you do it. Will it take a long time? Watch this. Yeah, nothing to see here. I swear, that's what they did. Bear in mind, in that visual sweep, there were 12 vehicles in this really confined space, and Because of that, you would think, well, they're going to look at fingerprints because who knows, that could have caused somebody to become unbalanced when they were striking him with the axe. He might have touched another car. As they were leaving, they might have touched another car. Yeah, but they didn't even bother. We won't even look for fingerprints. Also, and this must mean that the forensic expert and the forensic photographer were really close friends and worked together constantly, because they seem to have the same professionalism as one another, because that forensic photographer was at the scene for more than 2 hours and took 5 photos. The average 19-year-old girl takes more than that every 30 minutes. Seriously, that demonstrates a complete lack of care. 5 photographs, and even worse, all the 5 photographs basically concentrated on Daniel's body. None of the wider crime scene. And the truth is, when you look at the success of any murder investigation, it absolutely depends on the initial steps. Because the initial steps are all about preserving the crime scene and, most importantly, preserving any evidence it contains. The Met Police literally step by step failed to follow its own established procedure in this regard. No incident log form from any officer at the scene would ever be recorded. This wasn't somebody shoplifting from a local convenience store. This is an individual who's been found with an axe in his head, and there isn't a log form from any officer. It would be comedic if we weren't talking about the loss of a father of 2 children in the most brutal fashion. We're talking about a reality. It feels like a group of clowns came in to do this and just screwed up because they were completely useless. But I'm afraid that when useless, it becomes something more convincing of corruption. You can't help but sniff that out. Furthermore, if it can get any worse, but of course it can get worse, we have 40-year-old DS Sidney Fillery. He's one of the senior figures in the investigation. He's actually in charge of the Catford Crime Squad. So he takes statements from suspects. But when he's doing that, the problem that we have is he fails to disclose that he was actually somebody who'd undertaken work for Southern Investigations, so for Daniel's firm in the past. He'd even been drinking with Daniel and Rees the night before the murder. But it transpires that those connections that he has that seem a little bit too close, they went further than that. In fact, he'd been close friends with Rees for 5 years. That is an unbelievable conflict of interests. He's just happily going around taking witness statements. Now, the night that Daniel's body is found, the police go and tell Rees that this has happened to his business partner. And apparently he appeared unsurprised by the news, but he did look scared, pale and sweaty. That could be for lots of reasons. Instantly you're like, I feel a little bit like Rees might be incriminating himself here. But I guess you could see it in lots of different ways. It could just be that suddenly he's thinking to himself, oh my God, who have we annoyed? And am I next? That could be something that could concern him. It could be that in their line of work, these kind of things happen. Or it could be that he's unsurprised because he did know it was going to happen. Who knows? But he certainly doesn't look blindsided by the news. He confirms that he was with Daniel until 9 p.m. that evening. He then gets taken to the station for questioning. Now, according to officers present, his wife Sharon seemed petrified during the police conversation with Rees. Apparently she just stared at the TV, didn't say a word, despite being able to hear and understand exactly what was being said. Now, is that just me? If my husband was in a situation where the coppers came round and were like, your business partner's dead, mate, and it was with an axe through the head, there would be 1,000 questions by me, even if I was not even involved, to the police. I would be like, sorry, what? How? Why? Whoa, this is not making any sense. He was only with him the other day. Those kind of things come into your head, but no. And officers did actually later state that they were really surprised by her reaction. They expected more of one, given that her husband's business partner had been found murdered. And also we have, of course, the family of Daniel needing to be informed. So Senior Investigator Detective Superintendent Douglas Campbell, he actually manages to persuade Rees to break the news of Daniel's death to his wife, Iris. Allegedly, he reluctantly went to tell her, and he went with 2 other officers. I mean, again, you could say, well, he's reluctant because he knows what happened and he's feeling guilty. But personally, if the police were like, hey, can you just come and break the worst news ever to a loving wife and 2 children, I would be like, I don't really feel that's my job. I kind of feel on a boundary level that that's your job. You're the police officers. You go and tell them. But manages to convince him to do that. Now, even though the police had lots of interaction with Rees on that evening, there were no record of any discussions with Rees made. This is despite the fact that he was the last person to see Daniel alive. They didn't even take the clothes that he was wearing to forensically test them. He was basically interviewed and then told he was free to leave. In fact, he was told that he could drop the clothes off, but at a later point. This makes no sense whatsoever. I'm not implicating him. I'm saying that on a forensic level, you want to make sure there is no contamination, and you certainly don't want somebody to be able to go away with the clothes that they're wearing on the evening of a murder where they were with the victim and allow them to wash them or get rid of them full stop. That is an absolute joke investigation-wise. Now, initially, the theories around why Daniel was killed came down to work. People were saying, you know, he specialised as a bailiff and a debt collector. He'd been involved with lots of conflicts with debtors, therefore he'd made lots of enemies. Apparently he did have quite a strict regime. He had this zero tolerance approach to debts. So even if somebody had some legitimate sob story, he really didn't care. He just wanted the money. And that makes Daniel an objectionable and disagreeable character within his job. But again, is that enough to motivate somebody to think, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to kill this guy. Highly unlikely. However, after that theory is kind of posed, not long afterwards, the attention soon moves to his business partner, Rees. So they identify him as a relatively early suspect. And I wonder why. He had been the last person to see Daniel alive. Usually that would be the first suspect in these situations. Also, just going to throw it out there, just take your clothes home. You don't need to leave them with us. I mean, there could be loads of incriminating evidence on it. And with you being probably one of the major suspects at this moment in time, it'd be probably a good idea. But you just take it home. And I hear personal biological is really good for removing stains, so try that. Anyway, the kind of suspicion falls on him, and there's more reasoning behind why. It's not just because of the fact that he's in business with Daniel. It's because he was having an extramarital relationship with the same woman that Daniel was having an affair with. A little bit awkward. Just going to throw it out there. I mean, of all the women to have an affair with in the world, you go for literally the same one. She was an estate agent. Was it because she got reduced price homes? Who knows? There must have been some allure. But nonetheless, that would be awkward. And apparently, Rees was also worried about the fact that Daniel was going to dissolve their business partnership that apparently fell out over the running of the business. The other thing that was really problematic is that he'd given statements to the police which contradicted statements from other witnesses. So that is obviously going to move him up as far as a potential suspect is concerned. We get to the 14th of March, 1987. It's 4 days after the killing. Now, at this point, we also have concerns about DS Fillery. So Rees is saying that DS Fillery, who's involved in investigating this case, bear in mind, he's saying that they were all drinking together in the Golden Lion pub, so that Fillery was with Rees and Daniel the evening before the murder. But that's not what DS Fillery says. DS Fillery said that actually he was in the pub opposite, and it was Rees who told them to join him and his police colleagues in the Golden Lion. Now, in contrast, Rees had claimed that they'd been in the Golden Lion and actually met Fillery and his colleagues there. So clearly, at this point, it's obvious that one of them is lying. And this should make us be a little bit suspicious of both of them, that neither of their stories are tallying up. But we also have to say, well, DS Fillery doesn't sound too honest, even though I'm not saying that Rees was telling the truth about who met who and how it played out. But what I'm saying about DS Fillery is that he hadn't disclosed that connection to Rees and the conflict of interest that he'd actually worked for them, for example. And he had even taken a statement from Rees about what had happened. So this is a whole cooking pot of problems. There is no professionalism going on here. Also, he as in Fillery, had actually gone with him to search Southern investigation offices, and together they'd removed a quantity of files which apparently just vanished into thin air. That literally happened. So a guy who's meant to be investigating the case, who apparently was drinking with the victim the night before, who allegedly doesn't have the same story as to how that played out, but also didn't tell the truth about his connection to the person who died and to Reese, the individual who's being investigated, and was the individual who took a statement from Reese and then who went with Reese to actually remove information from Southern Investigations offices where Daniel worked. Subsequently, which all vanished into thin air. That isn't something that should make us all go, that sounds a whole heap of wrong. But hey, at the end of the day, this is the 80s. This kind of corruption just seems to be in every corner. Now, Fillery actually does get removed from the investigation on the 16th of March 1987. That's 6 days after the killing. And the reason for that was down to his friendship with Reese. Also, there were concerns that he was leaking information about the investigation to Reese. A little bit convenient. Also, a little bit suspicious. Why would you need to do that? If Reese is innocent, you shouldn't be needing to leak any information because you've got nothing to hide. And Reese, at this point, you would imagine would be laying low, but no. He just carries on socialising with the officers involved in the case, even after being identified as a witness. Guys, this actually happened. I'm actually telling you what happened. Can you believe how ludicrous this is so far? Does this make you question everything about law enforcement? Because to me, rotten does not describe anywhere near the level that we are going to right now within this case. Now, by the end of March 1987, the police had formed this view that Reese and D.S. Fillery were actually suspects in Daniel's murder. So Reese's brothers-in-law, 28-year-old Glenn and 26-year-old Gary Vian, they were at the time described as being part of a criminal fraternity. They also get identified as suspects, along with two other police officers, 35-year-old DC Alan Purvis and 34-year-old DC Peter Foley. Now, the 6 men, they were all linked through the involvement in provision of security by Southern Investigations to Belmont Car Auctions. Bear in mind, that is the same company that's suing the business in the High Court. Now, DC Purvis, he ends up being a cousin of a director of the car auction, and that car auction had been the victim of 2 robberies. Purvis had told his cousin that DC Fillery knew a man who could help them. That man was Reese. And Reese had apparently arranged for 6 men to act as minders at auctions. This includes the brothers-in-law Glenn and Gary Vian. Now, Purvis and Fillery had also been present at these events. Yet, whilst transporting over £18,000 of takings belonging to the Belmont car auctions to the bank, Reese claimed he was assaulted, had ammonia squirted in his eyes, and was robbed. Now, according to Reese, the night safe at the bank that he went to deposit the money in had been super glued shut. So he decided then to take the money home for safekeeping, and yet that doesn't happen because he ends up getting assaulted and robbed after parking his car. Now, the civil claim by the auction company had originated from these losses because it was suspected that the robbery had been staged. So you can imagine that at this moment in time, Reese is having this finger of suspicion pointed at him, and Daniel, who is his business partner, he's upset about the claim against his company. He didn't get involved in that. He doesn't want any kind of suspicion that he's this kind of negative individual getting involved, shall we say, in the underworld, stealing from other companies. He wants to disassociate himself from the legal proceedings because he wasn't involved in it. And it's suspected that this is the dispute that could have led to the killing. So Reese is kind of going on his own trajectory in a negative direction, and Daniel wants nothing to do with it. So we get to the 3rd of April, 1987. The police arrest Reese, Glenn, Gary Vian, D.S. Fillery, D.C. Purvis, and D.C. Foley, all on suspicion of Daniel's murder. Now, if this case couldn't get any more shocking, it's actually suspected that when those 6 suspects were meant to be arrested, it's likely they were alerted to their imminent arrests by a leak in the media the day before, which obviously gives them lots of information that's required if they need to get rid of incriminating evidence, for example. Now, later down the line, there were also allegations that the investigations into these suspects were inadequate. Really? Yeah, apparently they were inadequate. Why would that be associated with this case? Why would there be inadequacy? Surely they wanted to do a good job. Well, you'd think so, but it turns out that on this job, they just avoid any due process. And also, they get forensic experts who just use their eyes. They just use their eyes. Have a little sweep, nothing to see here. And it's kind of like that throughout the investigation. God, it sounds like somebody might be wanting to sink evidence. It does sound like that, doesn't it? It sounds a little bit like that. I think we can agree. It sounds a little bit like that. But again, when we think about all the facts I've covered so far, is that surprising for you? Is it surprising to think that this case was handled, shall we say, poorly, purposely? There is a level of maliciousness. Whatever is said throughout here, there is a level of maliciousness here, because we're talking about a dead man, a dead father, a dead husband, and no one is caring about the reality of this. So that's the accusation. And just to put that into context when we're thinking about the definition of inadequate, well, these guys were not even asked to provide alibis for the night of the killing. I kid you not. And also, several other lines of inquiry that were important were not followed through. So all 6 of those suspects, they just get subsequently released without charge. I mean, to be fair, you could have an infant go into an interrogation and the one thing that they would nail was the fact that they would ask, where were you on the night of the murder? But no, who needs to do that in these kind of cases? So we get to the 11th of April, 1988, and this is when the inquest into Daniel's death begins. And one witness who gives evidence was Kevin Lennon. Now, he'd previously worked for Southern Investigations as a bookkeeper, and he claimed that Reese wanted Daniel out of the business. So basically saying that's a motivation for why he'd get involved, potentially in a murder or a killing, or wanting him to be seen off. And he'd allegedly planned with police to have him stopped for drink driving. Now, bear in mind, there are some pretty strict rules anyway when you're working in financial areas, particularly if you get things like a DUI. But add to that the fact that if Daniel didn't have a car, he wouldn't be able to do his work. So he'd have to give up his partnership to some degree in the agency. But apparently this plan hadn't materialised. And after that, Reese had apparently allegedly spoken about having Daniel killed on multiple occasions. He'd even apparently asked Lennon to do it. Now, when Lennon repeatedly refused, Reese then went further and just said, okay, well, if you're not going to do it, do you know anyone who would do it? Now, Lennon also stated that in 1986, that's a year before Daniel's eventual death, Reese had told him that the Catford police officers would carry out the killing or arrange the killing for him. I cannot even begin to describe the level of frustration, sadness, and anger I feel about the possibility that police officers would have ever been involved in that kind of action. They're here to serve and protect. The idea that they could be involved in planning murders is truly terrifying. Also, apparently, the Catford police officers who'd offered to do it said it would take place within Catford Police Station's jurisdiction, meaning that those very same officers who would have bumped Daniel off would be the ones to investigate it. Conveniently. He also claimed that DS Sidney Fillery was actually aware of the scheme. So the plan was for him to retire from the police on grounds of ill health and then take Daniel's place as a partner of Southern Investigations. And that actually did happen in 1988. However, even though this evidence is literally dynamite, I mean, it's dynamite beyond belief, isn't it? It ends up getting discredited because it transpired that he'd previously been convicted of tax fraud. Now, I don't get that. I know there are rules and regulations in British law. But the idea that you can't be a witness to this information because you've been done for tax fraud, I mean, that is a completely separate kind of offence. That doesn't mean that you don't know reality and what happened. But yeah, dynamite evidence just gets discredited. Now, the coroner who actually investigated this particular situation and has to rule on the death, they claim there was no evidence of police involvement in the murder. But what the jury at the inquest find is that Daniel had been unlawfully killed. Don't think you needed anybody like Einstein to come out with that. He had an axe in his head. Clearly he was unlawfully killed. Now, on one level, what I would say is it's kind of a victory for Daniel's family because they were literally determined, and rightfully so, to see someone brought to justice for his murder. It doesn't bring them any closure. So they carry on campaigning, they carry on lobbying for a further inquest. And in June 1988, an investigation is actually launched by the Hampshire Police Complaints Authority into Daniel's murder. And of course, also the Met's handling of the case, because there've been all these allegations of police corruption. Now, it was deemed appropriate for the Met Police to investigate the matter. Now, the reason that authority were asked to investigate it complaints-wise is because the Met had obviously had allegations of this corruption, and it meant that it was inappropriate for the Met Police to investigate the matter. This is meant to make the inquiry independent. And we can all imagine just how independent the police's investigation of the police is going to be. Because for me, the independence of that investigation is so questionable. So first of all, the investigation finds that Rees and another business associate may have been involved in Daniel's death, but they then went on to conclude that there was no evidence of any police involvement and nothing to support Lennon's allegations. You know, that tax fraud guy, nothing, absolutely no information at all that suggests that what Lennon was saying about those particular police officers saying they were going to murder him and then investigate the crime so that nobody got brought to justice for it. Yeah, apparently there was just nothing that connects that reality to Lennon's allegations. And also, they found that the original... and also, I am laughing, please understand, I am not laughing about the fact that Daniel has died. I am laughing because of what I have to tell you next. They also found that the original investigation had been thorough and proper. Thorough and proper. No crime scene sealed off, no alibis taken from suspects, individuals investigating the crime who knew the suspects and actually had favour with one of the suspects and started to work with one of the suspects down the line. But no, thorough and proper. There were no arrests, there were no prosecutions. That inquiry, as far as I'm concerned, is a whitewash beyond belief. Now, however, down the line, it also transpires that the Met Police, Hampshire Police, and Police Complaints Authority were actually very much aware of evidence pointing to the fact that the initial investigation had been flawed and, in some instances, incompetent. They knew. And yet, they literally brought out a report that didn't condemn any of it. In fact, said that the investigation had been fine. Imagine how that is for Daniel's family. Watching, waiting, trusting, and then being slapped with this shoddy, corrupt reality of these awful reports, bringing absolutely no justice or closure for them. We then get to February 1989. And I'd imagine for the family, there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel because Rees and Paul Goodridge, they get charged with Daniel's murder. Now, Jean Wisdon, that's Goodridge's girlfriend, she gets charged with attempting to pervert the course of justice. And even though there's now hope because, hey, there's 3 people in custody, the case against all 3 defendants is ultimately dropped by the Crown Prosecution Service. And if that isn't bad enough for the family have to manage because they're having to deal with this constant disappointment, Goodridge later sued the Hampshire Constabulary. So obviously that person gets financial gain from this situation whilst no one is actually being brought to justice from this horrific execution I'm talking about. We then get to 1997. Now, this is in view of further allegations of corruption within the Met Police force. A secret intelligence gathering operation gets launched. It's called Operation Nigeria Two Bridges. Now, this included an investigation into Rees and DS Fillery, and they actually bugged the offices of Southern Investigations because they hoped that the killing might be discussed, but instead it identified corrupt links between the two men and both serving and former police officers, as well as lots of known criminals. And it also established that Southern Investigations used corrupt practices. So this is one of the corrupt practices that they were willing to use with the police. They had actually planned to plant cocaine on a woman who was involved in a custody dispute with one of Rees's clients. The whole premise was if they put this cocaine on her, it would discredit her character in court. Can you believe that? They wanted to have her children potentially removed from her, and they were willing to do that because they had a client they were working with. You can't get more malevolent and despicable than separating a mother from her children. Now, fortunately, because of this bugging, Rees, the woman's husband, and a police officer, DC Austin Warnes, they get subsequently convicted of attempting to pervert the course of justice. Now, Rees actually ends up getting sentenced to 6 years in prison for that crime, appeals it, because obviously Rees doesn't want to be in, and they raise it to 7 years. So it didn't work for him in that case. Now, subsequent to the findings of the 1997 inquest, a murder review was launched in 2000. And this actually investigated the original murder inquiry, and it made 83 recommendations for a further inquiry. That's how many holes they saw in the original inquiry. So from 2002, there's a re-investigation into the murder. This is headed by DCS David Cook, and it's run in tandem with the secret operation known collectively as the Able Yard 1/Morgan 2 investigation. Now, to aid this investigation, the police actually went so far as to buy the property next door to one of the suspects. So they bought a house next door to Gary Meehan. That's all so they could conduct surveillance. So this eventually leads to Rees, Glenn and Gary Vian, DS Fillery and James Cook all being arrested. But even though they go ahead and do this, ultimately there is insufficient evidence to prosecute anyone. Now, Daniel's family are amazing. You've got to remember, this is spanning decades, but they continue to campaign. And because of this pressure, the Metropolitan Police Authority order the Met Police to produce a report on this case again. This is in 2005, but again, unsurprisingly, the subsequent findings failed to examine much of the case documentation. They identified a few failings with the original investigation, but not very much at all. They kind of go along with this idea that there was nothing wrong with the original investigation at all. So Daniel's family is still no closer to getting the answers they need, they deserve, and they should absolutely have the full support of by the authorities who should wish to find out who put an axe through his head. We get to March 2006. This is almost 2 decades after Daniel's murder. 2 decades of the traumatic grief of this family, 2 decades of an unresolved loss, an unresolved murder. And we get a new witness. This new witness is identified, and that means that another investigation into the murder is launched. So now another murder investigation is launched, the Able Yard 2 investigation. This is again headed by DCS David Cook. Well, later down the line, they find that DCS Cook was ineffectively managed during the inquiry and just breaks lots of police procedures and policies. So the investigation comes to an end there, and Rees, Glenn and Gary Vian and an associate, James Cook, they eventually get charged with Daniel's murder. Meanwhile, former DS Fillery, he left the police at this stage, he gets charged with perverting the course of justice. However, the head of the inquiry, DCS Cook, was subsequently found to have had improper contact with a witness. This was convicted criminal Gary Eaton. And it turns out Gary Eaton had provided substantial witness evidence for the investigation. That meant that in breach of his role, Cook had actually been in contact with Eaton on multiple occasions. So his activities of meeting up with Eaton on those several occasions meant that Eaton's evidence was excluded from the subsequent trial. So later down the line, it's alleged that essentially Cook was responsible for influencing and fabricating evidence of witnesses. This is a complete mess because you have to think about the amount of corruption and confusion and people going outside their boundaries professionally and how that impacts on what we're trying to sort out here, which is Daniel's killing. And on top of what I've just told you about DCS Cook, also turns out that he sold confidential information to a newspaper journalist, Michael Sullivan, that was during Abel Yard 2 investigation. Now, Cook said, and to some degree it kind of makes sense, that he was going to write a book on the police corruption with that journalist because he felt that there was a hell of a lot of corruption going on and people weren't doing anything about it. So when the police actually searched Cook's home, they did discover thousands of sensitive documents that he had essentially shared with journalists. Now, the reason that Cook said he did that, he said, look, I couldn't stop police corruption on the inside, but at least by doing this, at least with working with a journalist, I can shine a spotlight on it. So he could bring to light the corruption that he was dealing with every day on the job. That's what he said anyway. And I have to say, I give some weight to them. Because you would imagine if the police wanted to get this guy for doing what he'd done, they would do that, right? And you would think that they would want to do that because he's trying to out this negativity in the force, or essentially he's lying about negativity in the force. Either way, you're going to do an investigation on it. But no, they were never fully investigated by the Met Police and no charges were brought. And for me, that comes down to the fact that they're trying to keep the reputation of the force and they don't want him speaking out and essentially shedding a light on all the negativity that we've been talking about today. Now, the intelligence that had been gathered around this time identified Southern investigations, so Jonathan Rees and former DS Fillery, having contact with as many as 19 police officers. Now, of those 19 police officers, 10 had been convicted and in prisons for criminal offences, including false imprisonment, perverting the course of justice, drug offences, accepting bribes, and bribing an officer to destroy case files. So this is the whole heap of corruption beyond belief. Now, that investigation takes 6 years, and at this point the prosecution was abandoned by the CPS. So following the protracted disclosure process, more and more prosecution evidence basically had to be withdrawn. So the judge ruled that 3 supergrasses who were working with investigators could not stand as witnesses, which again is horrific because just because they're a supergrass doesn't actually mean that they shouldn't be able to tell the truth on the stand. But it ends up that by March 2011, the defendants have all been acquitted. This is utterly heartbreaking for Daniel's family. We're talking about decades, and this family are literally dealing with frustration. And it just really compounds grief. And what an amazing family Daniel has, that they fight and fight on. We get to 2011. The Met Police publicly admitted for the first time that police corruption had been a factor in the failure of the first police investigation into Daniel's murder. Furthermore, it's accepted that serving police officers, some involved in the investigation, had met frequently in the pubs with Rees and former DS Fillery. Very suspicious. This is even after the pair had been implicated in Daniel's murder. So they suspect that this is when they're given updates on the investigation. Now, Acting Commissioner Tim Goodwin, he actually sent Daniel's brother, Alistair Morgan, a letter of apology in March 2001. It's the first time that the police had apologised for their handling of the case in over 20 years. However, neither the apology letter nor 2 public statements made by the police provided much detail about what corruption had taken place. And it was really boiled down in the way that they described it as being the fault of one individual, which was former DS Sidney Fillery. The true extent of the corruption within the Met Police just was not fully acknowledged. And no man is an island, as they say, and DS Sidney Fillery may indeed have been incredibly bent that you could have fitted him into several different slot shapes, but the reality is there's no way that he had the power or the wisdom to corrupt in the way that it's been described that he has. Clearly, there were lots of different moving elements in this piece, and lots of those moving elements were wearing uniform. But the fact that they've not acknowledged it, that will be heartbreaking for the family. The family need that. Now, one of the theories that have been put forward for Daniel's murder is that he was actually investigating police corruption at the time of his death. So this included allegations of selling confidential information and also giving criminals inside police information. So it was possible that he'd been eliminated before those responsible could be exposed. Because let's be honest, the criminal activities those police officers were getting involved in, they were very, very lucrative. So it was alleged that the police blue wall, which is actually designed to protect officers in their fight against crime, was exploited. Because when any officer attempted to report concerns about corruption, they would often end up getting punished one way or another. So they get transferred, they get disciplined. But even though that was something that was put forward, that theory was never properly investigated. And you can imagine, can't you, if you're somebody seeing corruption and you go and speak to your chief officer and they basically punish you for it, it's going to give a message to anybody else around you that if you see this and report it, there's going to be consequences and they're not going to be good for you. It goes completely against the reality of what you should do when you're serving to protect. But realistically, when you have a job, a family, a career, it's really challenging to look at that power, see people dealing with horrible consequences of asserting the reality of wanting justice to be served, but actually getting battered down and broken by those in the power because they dared to speak up. And that's a powerful message. So on top of this, there were lots of accusations that corrupt officers were also being protected due to their association with the Freemasons. Kid you not. This includes DS Fillery, who actually became master of two different lodges in 1993 and 1996. If those of you who don't know what the Freemasons are, they're a group, an organisation. Used to only allow men in, they allow women in to some degree now. They have all these little rituals, and as my mum used to say, it's a boys' club essentially. But also, they're very powerful and influential. And when you're a master, it means that you're basically in charge of a lodge. You have to learn all these crazy things and you have to read from this bizarre book. And honestly, I will not pretend or profess to understand it. But what I know is you don't want to cross people who have a lot of contacts who are quite powerful. And certainly DS Fillery was one of those individuals. So we get to 2013. Can you believe right now that I'm talking about 2013 in relation to this murder? We are spanning decades and still Daniel's family have got no answers. We get Home Secretary Theresa May. She launches an inquiry into the circumstances of Daniel's murder. She wants to know about its background. Obviously is interested in the handling of the case since March 1987. Now, she didn't actually expect to find many answers, but what her main motivation was is she wanted to shine a spotlight on what she considered could be systematic failures and, of course, corruption within the Met Police. Now, specifically, that inquiry, which was chaired by Baroness Lady Nuala Alone, she aimed to address the police involvement in the murder, the role that the police played in the corruption when it came down to protecting those responsible for the murder, and the failure to confront that corruption. Also, to look at the connections and the alleged corruption between the private investigators, the police officers, and also the journalists at the News of the World. Big inquiry. Now, that inquiry, they expected it to take 12 months. It ended up taking 8 years and cost £16 million. The reason for that is there were all these considerable delays because, I don't know, the Met were struggling to part with information. They were like, oh, you want some documentation, do you? Yeah, no problem, we'll look into that. Sheila, could you go and look into this documentation? I can, Brian. Where shall I look? Well, we're in London. I suggest you maybe go to the Gambia and start there and then trace your way back alphabetically over the next several decades. That kind of thing was happening. So apart from the fact that the Met wouldn't part with information and it took ages for them to be willing to do so, now that led to them having to subsequently study over 1 million pages of material. And when they actually did the report, it was over 12,000 sides long. That was in May 2021 when it was completed. And even then there were further delays. So Home Secretary Priti Patel, she demanded sight of the report prior to its publication. Why, Priti? What's it got to do with you having sight of that first? You can say that you just want to consider any national security issues and human rights obligation raised by the findings and censor accordingly, but that's BS and we all know it. If it is rotten to the core, if our Met is so corrupt that you actually have to look at the information and see whether you need to redact any of it to protect them, then you're not protecting us. Back off, Priti. Back off. Fortunately, the panel actually refused to hand it over. They said, look, nothing affects national security. And the reality is that understandably Daniel's family, they thought Priti getting involved was damn suspicious. That Home Office 11th hour intervention really wasn't appropriate. And Daniel's family were not the only ones who were suspicious of this intervention. In fact, some MPs alleged that Priti actually wanted to protect her friends in Rupert Murdoch's media empire by redacting the report. I mean, could there be anything more corrupt than an individual who should be caring about the individuals who've been affected, in this case, Daniel's family, but also in the search for justice, tries to sink the report because she's got mates in the media? Honestly, it is so rotten to the core. Now, ultimately, they get to this agreement where a small team from the Home Office get to review the report, and ultimately it's published in its entirety on the 15th of June 2021. You won't be surprised to know, heavily criticises the Met Police and concluded that the measures that had been taken to tackle police corruption were fundamentally flawed. Now, apparently, when they did this review, it was a well-known practice that officers sold confidential information to journalists and other agencies. It still happens today, without a doubt. But former bookkeeper at Southern Investigations, they confirmed that during the period of April 1987 and 1989, the News of the World had been invoiced up to 500 times a month. So in 1 year, the News of the World had paid Rees £150,000. That just demonstrates the lengths the Murdoch-owned tabloid was prepared to go to try to obtain information. The report also criticised then Commissioner Cressida Dick for obstructing its access to documents and to sensitive information on the police internal data system, Holmes. So if you're wondering why Cressida Dick departed, look no further than this report. The report actually stated this: in failing to acknowledge its many failings over the 34 years since the murder of Daniel Morgan, the Metropolitan Police's first objective was to protect itself. In doing so, it compounded the suffering and trauma of the family. Absolutely 100%, that's exactly what happened. Now, in response, Cressida Dick denied there was any institutional corruption in the force. There isn't any. We have this 1 million pages of information that's led to this 12,000 plus pages demonstrating all the corruption, alphabetical order, with individuals accused of it. Didn't happen. Cressida, it did happen. It's evident. It's here. There was no corruption on my watch. Cressida, stand down. Just throwing it out there. Cressida Dick, sometimes the name suits people. Throwing it out there. That was inappropriate. I'm going to keep it in anyway, because I always do. You know what I'm like? It comes out of my mouth. I'm just going to acknowledge it. Cressida Dick, if the cap fits, wear it. Anyway, she says, nothing to see here. And this actually led to Daniel's son, Dan, saying what was absolutely needed to be said. He said, you need to consider your position. Because at the end of the day, if she is just denying that there is any corruption, she's denying willingness for change. And if you're not going to change a corrupt organisation and institution, then there is no hope for that institution. Now, that report did actually give recommendations, and one of the recommendations was they did feel there was enough evidence available to charge numerous people, even though it didn't find that it could charge specifics on police corruption, which kind of is a bit mind-blowing. But nonetheless, they kind of made these recommendations. And one of the big problems that they found was about Rees and Fillery's connections. That was obviously deeply problematic because Fillery was in the police and feeding information to Rees, and then they had a partnership and so on and so forth. So clearly evidencing this really inappropriate relationship and what that could mean. Now, you won't believe this because bear in mind, Daniel's family are the absolute losers here. And yet Rees and the VM brothers, they go ahead and bring civil proceedings against the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police for malicious prosecution and misfeasance in public office by former DCS David Cook, who had headed the two investigations. And in July 2019, the High Court awarded Rees and Glenn Vian £155,000, and they gave Gary Vian £104,000, which for Daniel's family must be galling because, let's be honest, we certainly haven't settled the suspicion around these individuals. Now, what is astonishing and frustrating and devastating for the family as well regarding this case is that they've spent over £30 million investigating it, and yet in 35 years, no one's been convicted. But if you have contacts like mine, or you have contacts with anybody in London's underworld, all you need to do is ask them who killed Daniel, and they'll tell you exactly who is responsible for that murder. The murder has been described as one of the worst kept secrets. But apparently all that money and all that investigation can't even turn up what a local con on a street corner in London can tell you. Bit worrying. Also, the killing's been described as the most investigated unsolved murder in the history of the Metropolitan Police. But like I said, maybe you don't need the police to investigate and come up with the actual individuals who did it, because the London underworld know exactly who it is. In fact, lots of individuals in authority know exactly who carried out this murder. The question is, why haven't they been brought to justice? Now, the police handling of Daniel's murder had the most devastating impact on his family. For more than 3 decades, they've had no form of closure whatsoever. And the impact has been exacerbated by the belief that the very people supposed to protect them, the very people who should have investigated the crime, who should have brought the killers to justice, were evidently involved in covering it up. And that is ultimately the most devastating experience for any family. To believe that the people that you need to trust in the moments of your most vulnerable and weak are those who essentially are wielding their power over you and preventing you from getting the justice that you so sorely deserve. This case demonstrates corruption in its deepest, at its darkest, and just how far the fabric of those connections run with our media, with our Met Police, with other organisations that are meant to investigate, and so on and so forth, all working together to hide truth and to prevent justice. It's a web of deceit far greater than I could have ever envisaged when I started researching this case. I'm sure you found it quite difficult because there is so much information that I've shared with you. I hope that you understand how Daniel Morgan's family must feel a little, because they're still dealing with this decades on. And I'd be really interested to know your thoughts on who you believe the killers are. Like I said, it really is the worst kept secret. I'm not going to say the names here because obviously I don't want to imply myself in some kind of horrible litigious suit. I'm just saying, it doesn't take long to figure out who the culprits are. You might even already know or believe that you know. Tell me in the comments. Let me know your thoughts. Do you feel happy that Cressida Dick is no longer in charge of the Met Police? And how do you feel about Preeti trying to protect her powerful media mates? It's really difficult when you see how these individuals in authority they're meant to protect you are basically just paid up puppets. Tell me what you think. And remember, guys, just be safe, because sometimes the only thing we can do is protect ourselves. Because as I cover again and again, it seems like some of the people who are employed to do that for us, they're our worst enemies. Take care, guys, and if you want to see more of this, then join me on a Wednesday and a Sunday every single week where I deep dive on these cases. Crime and consistency is my catchphrase.